I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away in a green and mountainous land, there lived a young lad called Jon. Jon was an idle, good-for-nothing fellow who had grown very tired of living in his quiet village. He wanted to go and seek his fortune in the big city. He had always lived on his wits, and never very honestly at that. So having no family to speak of, there was nothing and no one to stop him setting out one day on the road that led south. He was not sure which way to go, but he didn't really care. He just took his time. When he was hungry, he stole fruit from an orchard or eggs from a farm. And when he grew tired, he would rest and sit and daydream about life in the big city. He wandered along through a forest, thinking to himself, something will happen if I trust to luck. He was growing hungry again, so he waded through a stream, hoping to catch a trout. But try as he might, the fish were faster than he was. On and on he walked. He was now many miles from his village. At last he came to the edge of a forest where there was a beautiful lake. It was clear and cool and blue, and great rocky hills towered behind it. Jon was wondering just how far he was from the city now, when his eye was caught by a bundle on the ground. It was a bundle of clothes. Looking round to make sure that the owner was not about, Jon quickly picked up the clothes and hurried away into the bushes to change. To his great surprise and joy, he found himself dressed in a priest's robes. Anyone else would have put them back, but not Jon. They fitted him perfectly. And as he looked at his reflection in the lake, he decided he made a very fine priest. What luck, he chuckled. People are always kind to priests. I shall do very well. And he began to practice making blessings as he walked along. After another day's walk, he did at last reach the outskirts of the city. He was delighted, for everywhere he went he was treated with great respect. People seemed to welcome his blessings. He did find the long skirts of his robe a trifle awkward, But when people stopped and gave him alms, it was all worthwhile. I do like being a priest, thought Jon. I'll never have to work now. Jon certainly wasn't a very honest or honourable man. He was growing hungry again, so it didn't take him long to steal an apple. But this time the owner caught him. "Please don't take that one, Reverend," sighed the man. "It's my best." And instead he gave him one with a bruise. Being a priest, Jon couldn't complain. It was charity after all. He walked on, very excited at being in the city, and was just wondering what to do when a baron came by, and seeing him standing close to the castle gate, said, "Come on, the feast is this way. Hurry up or we'll be late." Jon had no idea who the man was, but a feast meant food, so he followed quickly. Now the baron had presumed that Jon was the new royal chaplain, on his way to the Queen's birthday party. The old chaplain had died last month, and Jon looked distinguished enough to be his successor. Jon couldn't believe his luck. Here he was in the castle of the king. But only a week ago he'd been living in that dull little village, always getting into scrapes and being told off by the village elders. Now he was a priest in the company of nobles and being treated with such respect. The food was brought in. Jon's mouth watered as he watched the servant girls carry in large plates of roasted meat. He certainly wasn't going to miss this feast. Even if he was caught, he would enjoy himself first. Suddenly, the whole court made a low bow. Jon was quite taken aback. He could not work out what was happening. But then he saw the reason for their homage. The king and queen had entered. They walked slowly past the courtiers up to the royal table. The king sat, and the courtiers followed suit. Jon found himself at the far end of the table. Now, although it was the Queen's birthday, she didn't look very happy. Indeed, she was very sad, for her favourite necklace had just been stolen. The king was upset too, and he announced to the court, "It is most distressing that my wife's birthday should be spoilt by the theft of her necklace. Let us pray that God sees fit to reveal the thief and make this truly a day of joy. There is a reward for him who discovers the culprit." The court pondered silently on the king's words and then waited for him to taste the meat. The banquet began. There were many meats and fine wines, and plate after plate of delicious dishes were set before the guests. It was truly a feast fit for a king. At first, no one talked very much, luckily for Jon, as they were all too intent on their food. Jon had to keep pinching himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Never, never in his whole life had he tasted such delicious fare. How he wished the village elders could see him now. How he would laugh at their expressions. Jon kept very quiet, for he did not want to give himself away. But he was beginning to feel rather thirsty, for he had finished his wine some time ago. He looked around for a servant to fill up his glass, but they all seemed too busy. Finally, Jon stopped one. "You're just the man I've been looking for." "You're just the man we've all been looking for." The servant went very white, and instead of pouring the wine, he spilt it down Jon's robes and dashed out of the room. Jon didn't think a priest should smell of wine, so he quickly left the hall. "What a clumsy servant," he grumbled. "All I said was he was just the man we were looking for." Then who should appear but the servant? "Forgive me, holy priest, I have committed a dreadful crime," he whispered. Jon looked at the servant. What was he talking about? Spilling wine wasn't so great a crime. "It was God's will you discovered me. I stole the necklace," said the servant. And he handed over the Queen's necklace. Jon was most surprised. "Please don't give me away," cried the servant, "for they will surely kill me." But Jon had other thoughts on his mind. "What luck," he thought. "I can use this to gain favour." He sent the servant away and went quickly over to where the Queen's pet monkey sat eating and dropped the necklace into its food bowl. Then he went back to the banqueting hall, hoping that he had not been missed. But everyone was still too busy eating to notice the priest had gone. So Jon walked boldly up to the royal table. Kneeling beside the king, he whispered, "Your Majesty, on praying for the return of the Queen's necklace, I had a vision. Please come." Now the king was very curious when he heard these words, so he rose and followed Jon. And the chamberlain, who didn't want to be left out of anything, hurried along behind. Now the king was so busy thinking about the necklace that he didn't think to question who this young priest was. Much impressed by his vision and his pious ways, he followed him outside. When Jon showed him the Queen's necklace, the king was overjoyed and cried, "Thanks be to you, good priest." Jon watched with great satisfaction as the king and chamberlain took the necklace. "The monkey must have taken it, Your Majesty," said the chamberlain, rather cross that he hadn't found the necklace first. The king was full of praise for the young priest and his vision. They hurried back to the hall where the courtiers were wondering where the king had disappeared to. The king was in high spirits. He marched down the banqueting hall, holding the necklace high in the air, proclaiming that God's will had been done thanks to this holy young priest. The king insisted that Jon should sit beside him at the royal table. He told the courtiers how it was that the monkey had stolen the jewels. The chamberlain was very cross at losing his seat. The queen was overjoyed at the return of her necklace, for it was her most treasured possession. The banquet began once more with delicious fruits and cheeses. The queen was now very happy. The day had ended well after all, thanks to the young priest. The king was very keen to reward Jon for having found the necklace. But Jon wanted nothing, just the chance to serve the king and his people. The king was most impressed with the young priest's piety, and he decided that Jon should be made his royal chaplain. Jon was very pleased. That was exactly what he wanted. Now he could live in the palace in great comfort with plenty of good food and rich and noble people to converse with. Never again would he have to worry about how he was going to get enough money to live. Never again would he have to think about work. Well, that was what Jon thought the day he accepted the king's offer to become royal chaplain. But he did have to work. He had to carry out all the duties of a priest. It was all quite scandalous, since he had never been trained. But that didn't stop Jon, and being quick-witted, he learnt quickly. He had to preach sermons in the royal chapel. At first his sermons were most peculiar, for he made them up as he went along. And when he couldn't think of what to say, he would mumble into his robes. Some of the congregation found his sermons very unusual, and others found them distinctly odd. But since the chaplain was such a favourite with the king, none of the courtiers would dare to mention this for fear of being punished. The king had a habit of nodding off during the service, and he never noticed Jon's behaviour. Because he didn't really know what he was doing, Jon often became quite muddled. So that once, when he was marrying a young courtier to a lady-in-waiting, he became very confused, and instead of reading the marriage service, he read the prayers for the dead. The young couple did wonder, and the bride was most upset. Things happened at baptisms too. Jon was very fond of babies, but he wasn't quite sure how to hold them, and he nearly dropped many a baby into the font. But Jon persevered and soon began to enjoy being a priest. He practiced and practiced his sermons until at last he became quite expert. He began to feel true contentment for the first time in his life. He was so busy helping people, baptizing babies, marrying young couples, that he didn't have time to think about himself anymore. All the good advice he gave people every Sunday began at last to rub off on him. He no longer wanted to trick people or steal or do any of the other dreadful things he once would have done. Now he received true pleasure from being able to share his good fortune with others less fortunate than himself. And now he wanted for nothing, so he happily gave away what he had, something he would never have done in his old life. Time went by and Jon settled very happily into life at the castle. He had his own rooms where he could do what he liked when he wanted. He worked very hard at being the royal chaplain, and he was enjoying himself. He still wasn't quite like any other priest who had been in the castle. Then one evening, when he was relaxing in his room after a hard day's preaching, a servant came to him and said that the king requested his presence immediately in the Queen's chambers. It was very important that he should come at once. Jon wasted no time and hurried away to the Queen's chambers. It happened that the Queen was with child, and since it was to be their first child, the king was very anxious to know whether he would be blessed with a male heir. So this was why the king had called for Jon, since his royal chaplain obviously had second sight, for how else would he have known where to find the Queen's necklace? The king beckoned Jon over. Jon was feeling a little nervous, for he feared that perhaps the king had found him out. "Chaplain, I wish to know if the Queen will give birth to a boy," said the king. "It is most important." Jon was lost for words for a moment. Then he said, "Your Majesty, before I can say anything on the matter, I must retire and meditate. I will have the answer by tomorrow noon." The king was rather cross when he heard this, for he wanted to know right away, and he dismissed Jon rather grumpily. Jon hurried back to his rooms. What was he going to do? He had no way of telling whether the Queen's baby would be a boy or a girl. The king would expect him to give the right answer, and if he were to fail, who knew what might happen? He was bound to be found out. Hour after hour, he paced up and down in his room, hoping for divine inspiration. If only the answer would come to him. But no answer came. Jon felt so miserable he would have to do something. Now where were his quick wits when he needed them? At last, he could delay no longer. Bowing to the king, Jon said desperately, "I fear, Your Majesty, that the vision wasn't clear. It appears that on the one hand, as though a son would be born, but then, on the other hand, it could be a daughter." This only made the king very annoyed. What kind of a woolly-headed answer was that? He had thought the chaplain to be a man of vision. Jon returned to his room in real despair. How much he had changed from the dishonest young man who had made his way into the castle so many months ago. He enjoyed his job helping others and had no wish to return to his old ways. But now it seemed that the king no longer favoured him, and who knew what might happen to him when the child was born. Yes, Jon suffered greatly, and although he performed all his duties well, his heart was heavy. Then one day he heard the sound that he had been dreading for so long, a peal of bells to announce the arrival of the royal child. Now I shall certainly be dismissed in disgrace, Jon thought sadly to himself. And sure enough, Jon was summoned by the king to the queen's chambers. He went with a heavy heart. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he did ask God to protect him. The doctors were just leaving as Jon entered the room. Humbly, he went over to the Queen and offered his congratulations on a safe delivery. The king said nothing, but came solemnly over to where he stood. Then, wonder of wonders, he embraced Jon. Jon was quite taken aback. "Congratulations, my royal chaplain," cried the king. "Your vision was indeed correct. You shall be created archbishop." Then Jon understood, for he saw the nurses were each holding a baby. The queen had had twins, and yes, one was a boy and the other a girl. Jon was overjoyed, and he thanked God for answering his prayers. Everyone was delighted. The king was delighted he had a son, the queen delighted she had twins, and Jon was delighted his vision had been right after all. In due course, the royal twins were christened by the king's archbishop, now a much respected figure throughout the land, for his goodness and holiness.